Welcome back to my channel for data, machine learning, and tech career. In today's video, I'm going to go over a data set that has all the Netflix content, and we're going to use Python and Excel to demonstrate, how do we look at the data, and then how do we clean up the data a little bit so it's ready for your actual analysis. So here's the data set we have, and then we usually want to, look at, what columns we have available, like show ID, type, title, director, cast, country, date added, release year, rating, duration, and then usually we want to even look into, like what are the values really available. So then sometimes I would just click on the filter to see, what are the unique values, and then checking, use kind of checking what's the count of number of rows. But how do you do these all in Python? So the first thing first, I always like to look at the data sets in Python, but then it's not like Excel or a data set would just show itself. So that I always like to look at df.head to get the first 5 rows of the data. And then the reason I'm doing that is because you want to see what columns are available, but on top of that, you want to see what are the value like, right? Because country in this case is actual country name, but it could be like a country code instead of a country name. And then you also have release year, and it can be, just a 4-digit year, or it can be like year and then January 1st to show that it's released in that year. And so we do really want to try make sure that we know what the data we're playing with here. So the second one I like to run is df.info parentheses, and df is your data frame. And why do I like to run this is because in Excel you're trying to figure out what's the number of rows for each value, and then what are the missing values in your data sets. And when you run this, you're actually gonna get a very quick summary of what's happening in your data set. And so in this case, you'll show all of columns, and then you'll show number of rows that has null value. And then that means, like, for example, this 7,787 would mean that's the number of counts in your data sets, because you can see that many of these value or columns has the same value. That means that is probably the number of rows that you're gonna have. And then we're gonna look into like directors. What does it only have 5,398? And that means like it has a lot of missing values, and then so we might want to look into that later. So before I continue my video, please make sure you subscribe to learn more about data, and then we're gonna go right. So the other thing I like to look at when I look at a data set is that for a lot of the dimensions, if it's not an ID, I mean, ID will have too many values because it's a unique identifier of the column. But like for dimensions like type, it shouldn't have too many. Like, I mean, normally maybe it could have 4 or something, but I wouldn't know how many unique values are there or how many actual types are there. And then what I would do would be like looking at a filter and then figure out, oh, okay, there are actually 2 values that are available. But how would you do that in Python? So earlier when I was looking at Excel, the reason why I want to look into, like the columns are more like dimensions instead of like ID or unique values per row is because those key dimensions are going to be very useful when in terms of like how breaking down metrics, or like when you build charts, you want to add dimensions, so then your chart is not just like a summation of everything, because that's not very insightful. And so in order to do that, you can also do that in the same thing in Python, where you do df dot and unique parentheses, and df is your data frame. And you want to do that because that will tell you for each column what are the number of unique values for the 7,787 rows. And so in this case, you can tell that show ID and title are unique per row. So those are not what we would call dimensions, because those are not those are unique per row and they're too granular. And then we want to look into, like the type that has only 2 types, which is going to be a very good dimension to filter down. And then there's also ratings. There's only 14 unique values, which is also going to be very useful. And the other thing is, like, for release year, it shows 73. So we already saw that the year is like 20. It will show as like 2020. And so if there are 73 unique values in that, that means that we're actually covering a lot of years with this data set, if that makes sense. So after you're familiar with dataset, now we're gonna check the number of rows that has nulls or blanks. And in this case, we're gonna use df data frame dot sna. So sna is pretty much like checking if it's blank. Then it's pretty much saying like if it's blank or null, then we're gonna take a summation of it. So you add sna dot sum parentheses. In this case, you'll give you all the columns and the number of rows that are actually blank. And like earlier in our df.info, it already shows you, what the non-null count is. So it's pretty much using the row count minus the non-null count, and that's pretty much how you'll get this. And in this case, director has a lot of missing value, and I wouldn't say you should filter those out because it's a really big portion of your data set. But for cast and country, we might want to look into if there's other way we can fill in those data. And if not, then I think that is a small amount, which is fine. But I want to focus on the date added, which is this orange box here. The reason I want to focus that is because it's really suspicious that if a title or a content that was added to Netflix but didn't have a date added, we might want to look into those 10 and see if those are real data or not. So to check that 10 counts of missing date added, what you'll do in Excel would be, getting the blanks filtered. Okay, so now we see those 10 records. And now we see that they actually have, they all have pretty decent value, just not a date added. But then you might also want to check like if this is something that's duplicated, because why was there no date added? So maybe I'll check. Okay, so it's not duplicated and it just doesn't have date added. But I guess it can be still valid data. So you know how in Excel I will like try to filter down to a blank and see if other columns have value. I'm gonna show you guys how to do that in Python. So you know how in Excel I will like filter down to date added is blank and then look at other columns to see if other columns have values to verify that if these 10 rows of data are even like valid data. And you can do that in Python by doing df bracket quotation mark date added. So what this is doing is actually pointing in your data frame, pointing to that specific column and then checking if it's NA parentheses. It's NA parentheses here is pretty much like how you in Excel you filter to the blanks. Okay, so after you have done this, then this df bracket, this whole thing is pretty much like only filtering down to blanks or nulls. And make sure that okay, so this is a very tricky part because whenever you do filters in Python, you always have to do df bracket like twice, just to remember that. So after you have filtered down to only the blanks, now we're going to do a count. So for count, it's only going to count the values that are not blank or null. So then in this case, it's going to show for each column what are the number of rows that are not blank, but while the date added is blank or is a null. And so in this case, you're going to see that date added is 0 because all of them are already blank. And then looking at other values, so you can see that for those 10 rows of data that are blank, all 10 of them still have a show ID, all 10 of them still have a type, all 10 of them still have a title. All 10 of them don't have director, but director has so many missing value anyway. And for country, there's one that's missing. So this is very good information because it kind of shows us that it's actually still kind of valid data. And if you don't do count, if you remove the count, like dot count, if you just do this, like simply filtering, and when you just put this, then it will actually show you the rows or actual data that are for the date added is blank or is null. So you can also do that to check like how you checked in Excel.